Whenever
You still have an option? No, it's fine.
Okay.
Well, first, I'm glad to see this type of panel at AERA. It's interesting and somewhat telling that the room's not full. And I think that part of the reason why it's not full is because I think that there is an extraordinary amount of ambivalence around the role of educational researchers operating, in the public sphere. And I think some of it is for good reason. I think that there's this issue around professional demerits, which is very legitimate. Not only is there the concern that the work that we do in the public isn't significant, there's also the concern that the work that you're doing in the public is stopping you from doing real academic work. We've seen people who have, there's Charles Dresner, he was a political scientist at University of Chicago, very successful, very prolific, published 2 books on Cambridge prior to tenure, lots of articles. And he wrote a blog at a moment where blogs were still seen as very taboo. And the undercurrent there was, yeah, you wrote 2 books, but if you weren't writing a blog, you could write 3 books, right? So it's not just a matter of whether or not you meet the standards of an institution. There's also a sense that you're dabbling in an area that's taboo for academics. There's almost a purist ethic that governs our professional behavior, and as such, if we're not doing what we're supposed to be doing, it's seen as a demerit. I think also there's a growing skepticism around the notion of public that we've seen over the last decade or 2 decades or 3 decades. The notion of public itself is very dangerous, whether it's public assistance, public welfare, public housing, public schooling, whatever it is, there's a sense that if you're operating in the public, you're doing something that is counter to the sort of highbrow ethos of the academy. And so I think there are all these anxieties around the work that we do, but I do think that it's legitimate work, and I think that it's necessary work to operate in these public spheres. I think that for me, the decision to operate was part of a commitment as an activist. I've always been an activist, and so to me, operating in the public sphere was just an extension of that, trying not to quarantine this knowledge that we have, that we consider to be really, really important within the boundaries of a professional community like AERA, where maybe 10,000 people are members and maybe 200 actually read the articles, right? So I mean, even if I write an article in AERJ and publish it, which I think is incredibly important, it's indispensable part of what we do, very few people will get access to it. And if the general public gets access to it, I think it takes a long time. I think some of the few examples that have sort of knowledge claims that have sort of leaked into the public sphere might be things like acting white. That's actually a part, or the Ebonics controversy. I mean, we could think of things that have sort of started in the academy and made it into everyday discourse. But I think by the time they get into everyday discourse, they've been mangled so much that they're sort of almost unrecognizable. And I think that academics have stepped back so far from those conversations that that's almost an act of professional irresponsibility. For me, I've done my work in about 3 areas. The digital sphere, to be sure, through blogging, also through op-eds, and I've done a lot of work on television. None of those were sort of designs that I had in graduate school. They sort of just happened. Like, I didn't go to graduate school to be on TV, right? I mean, it's probably the worst way. If you ever plan to be on TV, getting a PhD is probably the least efficient way of making that happen. But what I did know is that I wanted to speak to broader audiences, and because what I was finding was these everyday conversations hinged upon certain not truth claims that I just found troublesome. And I think the job of the educational researcher in the public sphere is to offer counterintuitive claims. I think we have to challenge what counts as common sense to the general public. It's common sense that some schools are just going to fail. It's common sense that some people are just going to be poor. It's common sense that literacy just makes things better. I mean, and so how can you sort of operate in a conversation like that without challenging some of those very fundamental notions? And so for me, that's what the work has been. Through op-eds, I've been able to some extent, articulate my claims a little bit more, with a little more nuance than you can on television. When you go on television, the producer says to you, you have 5 minutes to explain why there's poverty in the world. And I've been on Fox News for the last 3 years on the visiting team. So I get about 90 seconds of that 5 minutes. And I'm being shouted over the entire time. And so in the context of that, you have very little opportunity to really flesh out a claim. And I think that you lie, right? Right? You hate America. And so I sort of laughed that we were sitting to the far right. It's the first time I've ever been accused of sitting to the far right. And I think that, so on a television screen, or even in an op-ed, you don't have a ton of time, so you have to be very careful about what project you decide to undertake, particularly in a field of red herrings, which will happen on any news screen, but particularly on Fox. So on an op-ed, I think one key that academics have to remember is that it's a sphere where people need very direct information. Academics tend to say that this is a complicated issue, right? That tends to be our immediate claim. This is a very complicated issue. And then we historically contextualize it. And then we explain the various arguments. And then we say, well, it's not exactly this, and it's not exactly that, but it's sort of somewhere in the vicinity of this. And by the time you've done that, you've written like 3,000 words, right? The average op-ed is somewhere between 400 and 800 words. I'm not suggesting that we eschew nuance completely. I'm not suggesting that we whittle down our claims in such a way that they become superficial, but we have to decide what's at stake in a particular conversation. We can't survey an entire field. We have to address an issue very directly. The use of data in the service of that is very important. People find data compelling. One thing that op-eds and television producers are very quick to do is to reduce our claims because of nuance. We have to resist that. In other words, the difference between correlation and causality is a very big thing for educational researchers, right? We don't want to say that something causes. Saying there's a correlation between something is very different than saying that there's a cause. TV producers don't necessarily get that. Or they do get it and don't care. And so there has to be this balance between not becoming sort of too focused on the nuances of an argument, but not conceding the nuance of an argument to the point where you actually start saying things like there's a correlation between, there's a causal relationship between owning a horse and going to Harvard. You know what I mean? Because those type of things make for great news, but don't make for good public intellectual work. And so I think striking that balance has been a challenge for me, particularly in a context where people aren't really looking for nuance or complexity. Those would be some of the things. One other concern I think people have, which I think is a legitimate one, is that once the notion of being an academic hovers around us being specialists in a particular area, knowing a whole lot about very little, right? Some people say until we know everything about nothing, right? And I think that that's okay, but in an op-ed piece, you may be an expert on higher ed admission, and now there's a fight on a higher ed campus that's racialized, and now they want you to talk about the racism, institutional racism, or you may be an expert on financial aid, and suddenly institutions are going under, and they want you to talk about the growing corporatization of higher education. And so it's outside your sphere of expertise. And so then you have to strike this balance. And I think the challenge of educational researchers, and really anybody, is that when CNN calls and says, we really need an expert on this, and you're not really an expert on this, you know a little bit about this, but you're not an expert on this, to decide how you're going to engage that kind of conversation. Because one of the biggest concerns and one of the reasons why people are wary of the so-called public intellectual is that at some point we begin to make normative claims in the world about the world that the public assumes rests upon our expertise.